Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the first edition of Vitamin C, your bi-weekly dose of marine education. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel and I am the online marine education program facilitator at the Ocean Science Center this summer. And the purpose or goal of these sessions that we'll be doing is to develop a connection between the marine research happening throughout Newfoundland and Labrador and the public. So this way we hope to encourage a continued interest in marine conservation, learning and protection for the future. So throughout the summer, we will be hosting bi-weekly learning sessions with numerous scientists to hear all about their experience with marine research and why this research is relevant to the quality and health of our oceans and why it's important for ocean protection, both locally and globally as well. So today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Uta Passow. She is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and is recognized as a world leader in her field of research. So we're very happy to have her today. And she is here to join us to talk about her research regarding oil spills. So I would also like to mention that if any of you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to post those in the comment section and we will do our best to discuss them throughout the course of the session. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Passow, and we'll let you take it away.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am excited to tell you something about oil spills. I myself haven't been in Newfoundland for too long, not quite 2 years yet, and I'm still learning about Newfoundland and Canada, but I've been doing oil spill research for quite a long time as one of my topics. Much of what we've learned comes from the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. We've been working on that for the last 10 years, so you will hear me refer to some of that data. But first to Newfoundland. This slide I actually stole from one of my students, and it shows really nicely that our waters are really important for us here, both because of oil extraction and because of fisheries. Both are important in terms of total amount of money and in terms of employment for the province. But of course, if an accident happens, then having a good fishery, the oil is a big threat. An oil spill would be a big threat to the fishery. So it's a little bit of a difficult combination. And together with that comes our environment, our icebergs and cold water. As many of you probably know, icebergs only stick out of the water to a tiny amount, about 10%, 90% of the iceberg is under the water. So if an iceberg decided to ram one of our offshore oil spill platforms, that would be quite dangerous. So compared to other regions of the world, the ice and the rough weather, the big storms have special challenges here. Now, the thing is, of course, we all use oil. We use it as gasoline for heating. Plastic is made from oil. And so even considering climate change and the need to use less oil, as long as we extract any oil and transport it, accidents might happen. Even if we try to reduce accidents by making good regulations and using safe procedures, a spill is always a failure. But we have to assume that it can happen. So what if a spill happens? What can we do to minimize the damage? That is the question here. Actually, Canada currently is funding a large initiative to develop a comprehensive response plan for oil spills. So the idea is that we can develop plans for mediating measures, for counteractive measures if a spill occurs. And many scientists here from Memorial University are involved in this program, and many scientists from other places in Canada and even worldwide are involved in this big initiative, with the goal to make Canada one of the leading countries for oil spill response. A good, effective plan requires a tight collaboration between academic scientists like myself, people at the universities, the first responders, which go out when there is a spill, the regulators who make the rules and laws, and industry who extracts the oil and puts out the oil platforms and is responsible for a large part of the cleanup. So what the science working together, what we're trying to provide is a knowledge which permits us for informed decision making. So trying to decide how to respond to a spill should be based on scientific knowledge, not on your gut feeling in that moment. The problem is that there's no simple solutions because every spill is different. Obviously, this is not a good situation for the dolphins diving through the oil, and seabirds don't like a lot of oil on the sea surface either. But if the oil is not on the sea surface and it goes to shore where it impacts a different ecosystem, or it goes to the sea floor, as you will hear in today's talk, where in the Gulf of Mexico example, it really hurts 1,000-year-old corals. They have still 10 years after not recovered, and people are estimating that it'll take, in some cases, hundreds of years to recover to pre-spill conditions, on average somewhere around 60 years. So depending on the response measures, the damage might be moved to different places. So every spill has to be, every response measure has to be adapted not only to the type of oil, but also to the type of environment and the season at which the oil spill happened. So there has to be an individual response. We just kind of can try to find the general connections and rules. Now, it is important to know, I often get asked, should we do this or that? As a scientist, science itself doesn't make the ethical decisions. It's not up to science to decide whether it's worthwhile to save the corals or the dolphins. That's an ethical decision. We can just say, if you do this and this, then it'll be better for the dolphins, but worse for the corals, or vice versa. That kind of, we can try to predict what might likely happen in a response. So one thing, if you talk about oil spill, that is really important now is dispersants. Currently, the use of dispersants is not legal in Canada. But more and more, since the oil spill 10 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, people are beginning to think that in some cases, in some types of oil spills, dispersants might be a good countermeasure. So just briefly, what are dispersants? Dispersants is a mixture of chemicals, which we make, and they get stored. And each molecule, each chemical, has a water-loving, a hydrophilic part, and a lipophilic or oil-loving component. So here we see it with the little black part is the oil-loving part, and the little red dot is a water-loving part. And so these dispersants, if you add them into an oil layer on top of water, they end up arranging themselves so that the little black part of the molecule sticks in the oil, and the red part is faced to the water. And so it allows the oil to mix better with the water. You know, for making a salad dressing, that oil and vinegar or oil and water doesn't mix very well. You have to shake it a lot to even get some droplets in the water. And so adding this dispersant helps make the oil go away from the surface layer and mix into the water. And this is here an example from the lab. So in both cases, we had a liter of water and we added 1 milliliter of oil. And in this case, we also added dispersant. And then we mixed. And you see there's a little bit of oil in the water here, but you can't really see it. Most of the oil is at the surface layer. But in this case, with the dispersant, most of the oil actually is mixed in the water. The whole water has come turbid. It's so concentrated. So that's what the dispersant does. It helps disperse the oil. It doesn't make the oil go away. It makes it go away from the surface layer. The slick is gone. But the oil is still there, but it's distributed in the water.
So, Dr. Passow, you mentioned that the use of dispersants is not currently legal in Canada. I'm just wondering why that might be. Obviously, one major benefit to using the dispersants would be that it does eliminate that slick on the surface of the water, but would there be maybe more significant disadvantages to using them as opposed to the advantages, and that's potentially why it's not legal?
That's a very, very good question. So in general, at the moment, there's just a law that you're not allowed to dump anything into the ocean, not plastic, not garbage, not, and not dispersant. So there would have to be made an extra rule which for an acceptance to accept dispersants under certain conditions, because the rule of not being allowed to dump things into the water is a good one. But dispersants themselves are chemicals, and they have toxic effects on some or many organisms. They're not harmless. We don't really know that much about them, so that's part of what this research is about, trying to find out whether the benefits of dispersing the oil are larger than the negative effects of having the dispersant in the water. So that is one of the big questions here. We don't really know, and we have to try to figure out under which conditions putting something harmful into the water has more benefits than not doing it.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, how do we do our research? So I personally am a field going and an experimental scientist. So we go out on boats, many oceanographers do. This is an example of a research vessel. And before we go on a research expedition, we load the boat with all the stuff we need. We have a very clear plan of what we want to measure. And so we fully equip our laboratories. You see it's very full here. So the boat has, just empty desks and spaces, and we filled it with our equipment and the gear we need during the cruise. And we also outside have the sampling gear. This specific little sampling device is called a multicorer, and it goes down to the sea floor, and then this heavy weight gets released, and these cylinders get thrust into the sea floor. And if you're lucky and don't hit a rock, then you will get a piece of sediment, a sediment core like these three here. So these came out from that, where you have a little bit of overlaying water, then the top of the sediment, and then going down deep. And what you can see in this specific sediment core, which was taken after the oil spill 10 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, is that you can really see a layer which is discolored from the oil. So a lot of oil came to the sea floor. Now that's really strange, isn't it? We are not supposed to have oil on the sea floors. Oil is supposed to float. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Are there any questions so far, or are we good?
I don't think we have any just yet, no, so I'll let you continue.
Okay, so the other way of what we did then in the field, other than taking these cores, is we put in so-called sediment traps. And such a sediment trap, as you see here on the left, is taller than me, so I couldn't look up into it. But it's basically is funnel shaped and is open. And so things which fall down get collected in here, and down here, this is a little out of focus, you have sampling jars, and it just turns around. So every 2 weeks you get a new sampling jar, and it collects everything for a 2-week interval, and again and again. And so here we collect falling debris, things like dust bunnies. We call the falling things marine snow, because if you're diving, it looks like a white snowstorm of things falling. So this marine snow we collect here. And this is a data set going for a year of such a trap in the Gulf of Mexico. And what we see in black, you see the oil, and the green and blue show you basically marine organisms. And the oil concentration over the course of the year, it went down because the oil got diluted or sedimented and went away. What you see is that the peaks are always at the same time as you have peak in the small organisms and other particles. So that gave us the idea that maybe the oil gets trapped in this marine snow, and syncs with it. So that was our idea. So then we go into the lab and try to test this idea. And in the lab, we use these what we call mesocosms, but they're basically big aquaria. And here we have them with different oil concentrations. We had 16 of these. And we also use smaller devices, these we call rolling tanks. And here is, if you have a particle sinking, because it rolls, it turns, the particle actually makes a little circle and never touches the bottom. And if you imagine in the deep ocean, it is 1,500 meters depth, the particle will sink for days without touching any bottom. Whereas here it'll take, 2 seconds or maybe a minute at the most for the particle to sink to the bottom. So this can simulate a particle sinking through the deep ocean. So we use different kinds of tools in the lab to mimic different parts of the processes. And by doing these different kinds of experiments, we found that we could simulate the formation of marine snow in the presence of oil. Here you see some fluffy one and here more dense one. But what you can really see is the oil droplets in all of these particles. So these are, you can see them visually per eye with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope for these. These are a millimeter or larger. So they're very small, but they're visible. Most things in the ocean are so small, we can't really see them that well. But they're full of oil. So we were right that our oil gets transported to depths with this marine snow. The oil, which is normally very light and stays at the sea surface, can be transported to the deep sea floor at 1,500 meters when there is marine snow. And that was a very, very new insight, which people didn't even look at the sea floor before, because oil doesn't sink, right? So basically this is a little schematic showing that.
How might that sinking oil with the marine snow impact bottom dwelling organisms then, both at, I guess, more shallow depths as well as the greater depths that you mentioned?
Yes, that is a good question. So it sinks to the sea floor, and there's organisms living on the sea floor, and some of them are living actually in the sand. We call them the infauna because they live in the sediment. And if there's a lot of such sedimentation, it can literally suffocate them, put a layer on top, this very big layer you saw here. This was in some places so big and so fast that the organisms which were, near the surface before, they're now so deep that they literally died. Other organisms, like the corals, they were covered. You can see here the fuzzy parts. They were covered with this marine snow falling on them. And not the whole coral died, but the branches that were covered heavily died and fell off. But there's also animals like fish, which go and feed on things on the sea floor. So fish that feed on the sea floor, nobody had ever really tested for oil, because why would there be oil on the sea floor? Now we did, and it turns out, yes, their muscles or their liver, they contain oil because they're eating oil that was sinking. So it does have a big effect. It moves the oil from the sea surface, where it impacts birds, to the deep sea floor, where it impacts different organisms. So it's a very good point. So as this marine snow sinks, all kinds of things happened, and it comes down to the deep sea floor. And so now we have a bit of a story. And the way we got the story in all its detail, I just gave you the overview now, it was by combining different methods. We had the field work with the trap and the seafloor samples. We had the experimental work on different scales, different types of experimental work. And then we used the insights we got here on how things work and the data of what happened, and compared in a model to see if we are right, if our processes can really predict what we observed. And a model is basically just a complex thought process, thought experiment. If something gets too complicated, too many things happening for you to think through it logically, you build a mathematical model, which then tests the different possibilities. And that can show you yeah, these processes can mostly explain what we observed, or no, these processes only explain 1% of what we observed. There must be something else, right? So this whole putting it all together, it's like a puzzle piece, helps us to understand the bigger picture. And thus we hopefully gain a predictive understanding of one process. And that's what we did my lab did in the last 10 years about the thinking. We got a good idea of how this happens. And now we can go and talk to the regulators and decision makers and say, look, if there's a lot of marine snow when the oil spill happens, then you have to assume that a significant amount of the oil will sink to the sea floor, and that'll impact things very differently, impact different organisms, change the whole dynamics of it. And so the responders, they have decision-making models which take account into these things. So if we are that far, then have we answered all the questions? No. With science, you answer one question and the next one comes up right away. So, and this is another slide I stole from a different student of mine. So one of my students right now, she is testing, will mussels eat the marine snow that has oil in it, and will it make them, affect their health? Will it impact them? So she has planned this experiment, and as soon as we are allowed to go back in the lab and work, she will conduct this experiment where she feeds the mussels with different things, with just normal phytoplankton and phytoplankton and oil and marine snow and oily marine snow. And here the blue dots represent the dispersant. So she'll also have phytoplankton and oil and dispersant, and then measure how the health of the mussel changes and how long it takes them to recover from such food. So that's another way on how to answer the next question, because marine snow is not only, it doesn't just sink, but it is a really important food source for many organisms in the deep ocean, because that's all the food there is, right? Phytoplankton, the plants in the ocean, can only grow where there's light, so they only grow in the surface ocean. And so all the organisms who live in the deep, dark ocean, they have to find food that originally comes from somewhere near the surface, so that sinks. So marine snow is one of the important ways to transport food down, not only oil. So I think, oh yes, we were talking about the sinking velocity of marine snow. So one of the important things is how fast does this marine snow sink? Because when it gets eaten at depths, or on the way while it sinks, the chance of it being eaten, of course, is much bigger when it sinks very slow. And so one of the important experiments we did was to try to measure the sinking velocity of the marine snow. And we had expected it to sink much slower than the marine snow without oil, because oil is so light, right? So the light oil would move it back up. However, what we found is that the marine snow with the oil sinks at least as fast, or maybe even faster, than marine snow without oil of the same size. So if you compare a 1 millimeter marine snow particle without oil and a 1 millimeter with oil, they both sink at the same speed, or maybe the one with oil even sinks faster. So why would that be? That one took us a month or two of thinking to figure out. But I think we've got the solution. What happens, I think, is that the oil that is so gooey, it packages the marine snow much, much closer. In a way, marine snow is like the dust bunnies of the ocean, we sometimes call it. And like dust bunnies, marine snow is very loose, very fragile. It's not very densely packed. It's not solid. It's kind of this fluffy thing. And so the oil, I think, allows more particles in the same amount of volume, in the same space, because it packages them tighter, because it glues things together and pulls it together. And so that makes it sink faster. So those are the kind of details we then go into once we've understood the general process. Because if you want to do a model, you have to know the sinking velocity of the snow, a mathematical model. So then you need to find these kind of parameters to explain what happens. And if the oil, by the time it reaches the muscle, is maybe already degraded or still, you know, in its original form, how it has changed, it has gotten old or not.
I do have a
Okay,
question
thank you.
regarding that actual point, if you don't mind. I'm just wondering, I know you said that the smaller oil particles tend to, I guess, kind of act like glue between the marine snow, and I'm just wondering if by using a dispersant, would that potentially enhance that problem? Do you see that it's more serious when you do use a dispersant and then in terms of the marine snow, or would it be less significant? I guess just kind of in terms, I'm just wondering the use of dispersant versus not, I guess, how that would kind of impact it.
That is a very interesting question, which we haven't really answered yet fully. So the question here, whether the dispersant changes this process and the effects. Dispersants, as I said, means there's a lot more oil droplets in the water. Having a lot more oil droplets in the water means you have a lot more oil droplets which can get caught in the aggregates and incorporated. So you have more oil in the aggregates, which means more sinking of oil. On the other hand, we think, and this is just a hypothesis at this time, which means we don't know yet, we are testing it. We think that the dispersant also impacts the ability of the algae to make marine snow. So we think that it inhibits that, so that we have less marine snow. So we have less marine snow with dispersant, but more oil droplets in each marine snow particle that there is, which means we maybe sink a lot more oil, but less marine snow. But we are not sure yet. We are trying to understand that. And the same thing is with the effects. So people studying the corals, my colleagues, they have some indication that the corals respond even more negatively, that they get harmed more if there's corexit in the mix than if it's just oil. So only oil also seems to harm them, but less so than oil plus corexit. So the mixture seems to be a bit of a problem. On the other hand, having a lot of little droplets rather than a big slick means that the bacteria, we call that microbial degradation, that the bacteria that eat oil can do this much more efficiently. Bacteria like little droplets because they can get on the surface, whereas a big blob, they can't get into the oil, they need the outside. So the dispersant, one thinks, is going to increase the ability of the bacteria in the water to eat the oil, to get rid of it, to degrade it. We call it biodegradation. Like in the compost heap, when bacteria and fungi get rid of the compost and degrade it. So we are not sure how this process of the microbial degradation gets impacted by corexit, by the dispersant. The dispersant might look for other bacteria, or it might and then grow other bacteria that degrades the dispersant. Or so it's a difficult. There's different things happening at the same time. The smaller droplet sizes helps with the degradation by bacteria, but the dispersant itself might inhibit it a bit.
Interesting. I do have a couple of audience questions for you as well.
Oh, great.
So the first one is from David, and he's asking if marine snow is capturing oil, could an analog be used to capture or contain oil as part of a spill cleanup or control for a spill?
Yes, people are trying, they're not using marine snow, but they're trying to develop things like kind of sponges which soak up the oil. And then you could, take out of the water, remove the oil, into a boat or into a container and then put the sponge back in the water, have it soak up the oil again. So people are working, many engineers are working on ways to try to collect the oil like that. Part of the problem is if the oil is very offshore, you will always collect quite a bit of water together with the oil, and of course you can't separate it easily. Then you have a huge amount of waste, and if the ships have to carry the waste to land to process it more, that sometimes becomes logistically very, very challenging to collect oil, and to have enough ships to collect enough oil and bring it to shore all the time. If it's a near-shore spill, that would work much better.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it all depends, I guess, on the resources available to do that kind of thing as well.
Yes, and you know, there's some places where there's oil platforms. There usually is near there, they have facilities to deal with oil spills, right? But not with huge ones. So then you have to bring them, like this dispersant I was talking about. There's stocks of them, and they're stockpiled, and hopefully we won't need them, but they exist and they're there because you can't begin producing it right when the spill happens. So yes, depending on where you are in which country, different countries do have facilities to deal with oil. Sometimes we burn the oil on the sea surface too, in situ burning. That's another interesting way of trying to get rid of some of the oil.
I have another audience question. Justin is asking, are there any particular challenges to oil spill research or cleanup in Newfoundland offshore cases versus the Gulf of Mexico cleanup efforts?
Here, well, yes, definitely. First of all, the really cold temperatures and the possibility of ice is really challenging. Having an oil spill in ice is a nightmare of most spill responders, because yeah, that would be hard to deal with. The other thing is generally when we work with, you know, I try to work with I work with a local species. So working here, I have to work with species that grow at, 0 degrees at freezing temperatures. And that's much harder to work with and have cold rooms that cold than with something that, is at 20 degrees. So it is a little bit more challenging, both from the environment here and from the working conditions. And the environment, of course, other than the ice, is also the high wind speeds and the high ocean. If you can't collect the oil with sponges or use dispersant if you have huge waves going on. You need a fairly flat, clear slick to do any of those things. So it is a challenge here.
All right. Do we have any other audience questions? Looks like we just got the two, but we'll give it a minute to see. I did have one other question for you, just out of, I guess, general curiosity for anybody, I guess, maybe who might be wondering. Do you have any plans to further your research at this time, or is it something you're continually working on, or?
So at the moment, for research projects, we need funding of some kind. And at the moment, I'm funded through this big Canadian government project to look specifically at the interaction of oil dispersant with natural particles and marine snow formation. So we are working on this. We have 3 PhD students, a master's student, and a technician working on that. So it's a fairly big group. And I'm talking to other people about collaborations. I'm planning a collaboration with some people in Norway. The Norwegians have a lot of oil spill research, and also with some other groups here in Canada. So yes, will definitely be part of my lab. It's not the only thing my lab does. We also do climate change research, but it's a big, important part.
Interesting. Did you want to tell us a little bit about the comic that you've got as well? I know that's something that that you guys do as well. I saw another one, I believe, about phytoplankton on your profile page on the Pokemon website, but this one is a fun little comic that you've got if you want to tell us about it.
Yeah, so it's always you wonder how you can tell people about what you do in a way that is not boring and too scientific, but still correct. And so I've met this comic artist, Andy Warner, and I've done a couple of comics with him. One, as you just mentioned, on climate change and ocean acidification for algae, and this one about oil. And I saw you attached to the invitation, so that is really cool. So everybody has it and can read it in peace. But basically the idea is I tell Andy kind of a bit of a story just in words, and he then puts it into pictures. And we go back and forth a few times. I maybe say, oh, this doesn't quite capture it, and can we change that? But basically he does it all, and this is what he does. I think he's really neat. You can check him out. Andy Warner is his name. It's down here in the corner, and he has a whole web page with comics. Many of them have scientific topics, not all of them, but many.
It's interesting. It's a good method of delivery for anybody who, I guess, maybe isn't necessarily used to learning about that type of information just on their own. It kind of simplifies it, but also gets the point across nice and clear. So it's, yeah, I thought it was really a really cool little addition for sure.
I think it's really important to think about any kind of issue, no matter what, about different ways. You know, you can be an artist and go into an art gallery, and sometimes you see something there which reminds you of whatever it is you're thinking about, or, you know, a comic or reading or scientific graphic. So it all contributes to making us think about important issues.
For sure. Well, I guess if nobody has any other questions, I guess that concludes our session for today. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Passow, and thank you to the audience for attending and listening along. We hope you guys learned something new. So stay tuned for our announcements regarding our next session, which will be a little bit of a double feature, since we do have one next week as well. So it won't be bi-weekly for the first two weeks that we have going on. But some announcements will be made later this week regarding that. And so thank you again, Dr. Passow, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful holiday tomorrow.